Have you ever had that feeling that a single act of kindness, something you did with a pure soul and a hopeful heart, was exactly what dug your own grave? Sometimes, compassion is the most costly mistake a woman can make, especially in a place where the walls have ears and the past is kept under lock and key. Imagine yourself in a silent room, surrounded by the smell of old paper and dust. The kind of place where time seems to have stood still, but where each document holds the weight of an entire life. It was there, among the shelves of this small town's public library, that Alina made the decision that would change everything. She wasn't a rebel. She didn't seek justice with her own hands, nor did she desire chaos. She was simply someone who wanted to belong. And perhaps that sounds familiar to you. That desire to be accepted, to protect those who, deep down, would never lift a finger to save you. The report lay in her trembling hands, a yellowed sheet of paper bearing names, revered by everyone there as if they were saints. Irregularities, deviations, secrets that could crumble the house of cards of the region's founding families. Alina looked at those signatures, and, in a moment of pure mercy, believed it was merely a bureaucratic error, a human failing that didn't deserve to destroy the legacy of generations. She saw no malice. She saw humanity where there was only greed. In the absolute silence of that room, the sound of the striking match rang like thunder. Small, orange flame began to lick the edges of the paper, and Alina felt a momentary relief. She thought she was protecting the peace of the city, burning the evidence of others' corruption so that everyone could continue living their perfect lives. But what she didn't realize what comes next may surprise you that the silence of that library wasn't empty. Someone was watching her from the shadows, between the dark oak corridors. Someone who didn't see a gesture of mercy, but rather the destruction of a lever of power. As the paper turned to black, volatile ashes, Alina's fate was sealed without her knowing. Stay with me until the end. Because what began as a silent sacrifice would soon transform into a battle cry she wasn't prepared to face. The city, the one she loved so much and longed to call home, didn't react with gratitude. The air changed. The temperature dropped. The following morning, the sun rose with a cold glow. Alina walked to work, feeling the weight of a secret she thought she had eliminated. But the truth is that secrets never die. They only change form. As she crossed the central square, the usual good morning didn't come. The once indifferent stares were now sharp, like blades ready to cut. Have you ever felt like that? As if the whole world had received a memo about you, while you're still trying to understand what you did wrong? Her vulnerability was palpable, a fog surrounding her as she realized that her attempt to save the peace had turned her into the only witness to a crime no one wanted to admit. This is where danger ceases to be an abstract idea and becomes something physical, present in the form of cars that pass too slowly by your window and voices that fall silent when you enter a room. But, amidst this growing hostility, there was one pair of eyes that didn't change. Silas, the sheriff, the man who carried the weight of the law in a badge that many considered merely an accessory, was there. He was always there, parked on the periphery of her vision, watching not with the city's disdain, but with a grim vigilance. He knew what Alina had done. He knew the smell of burnt paper, and knew that, in that small gesture, she had lit a fire that he would have to extinguish with his own blood, if necessary. His protection was still just a shadow, an implicit presence she wasn't sure she could trust. After all, how could she believe in the arm of the law, when the law itself seemed to be in the hands of those who wanted to destroy her? Alina felt the net closing in, social isolation becoming an insurmountable wall. She was alone, or at least that's what she thought, as she tried to understand how an act of kindness could generate so much hatred. The tension in the air was almost palpable, and she knew deep down that the calm was over. Something much bigger than a simple report was at stake, and the city wouldn't stop until the ashes of that paper were replaced by the ashes of her own life. But Silas's silence was about to be broken and what he had to say would change everyone's perception of who the real victim was in this story that was only beginning to unfold. Would you like me to continue developing the next section, exploring how the city begins to physically react against it? The feeling of isolation began to weigh on her, as if the city air itself had become thicker, harder to breathe. Alina tried to maintain her routine, but the routine no longer recognized her. Upon entering the small bakery, where she used to buy her artisanal bread every morning, the tinkling of the bell above the door, which had once seemed like a cheerful greeting, now sounded like an alarm. Conversations ceased abruptly. The baker, a man she had helped with his children's homework months ago, didn't even lift his eyes from the counter. He simply placed the brown paper package in front of her, took the money without touching it, and returned to the back of the shop. There was no usual "have a good day, Alina." There was only emptiness. Walking back home, she felt eyes on her back windows closing, curtains swaying slightly, whispers dying away as she passed. It's a cruel form of torture, being erased from a community you tried to protect with a gesture of silence. Perhaps you've experienced something like this, that moment when your loyalty is tested and you find yourself alone in a desert of familiar faces. If this kind of feeling, of being the only person acting with your heart while the rest of the world arms itself, resonates with you, know that you've found your place to hear these truths. Because here at Heart of Protection Stories, we value precisely that silent courage that no one else sees. Fear, however, didn't remain merely silent. Upon reaching the porch of her small wooden house, Alina encountered the first physical sign that the city had turned the page from indifference to aggression. Someone had painted a red mark on her door. It wasn't a clear symbol, but the message was obvious: we know. Panic began to rise in her throat, a cold tightness that made her want to run. But where to? She had no one. Or so she believed, until the sound of a diesel engine, slow and steady, broke the quiet of the street. Silas's car pulled up alongside the curb. He didn't get out immediately. Through the slightly tinted window, Alina could only see the outline of his hat and the smoke from a cigarette he rarely lit. There was something comforting about his presence, even though he was the authority who, technically, should have been investigating the disappearance of that report. Silas was a man of few words, but his presence filled all the space around him. He represented the kind of protection that doesn't need promises to be felt. If you too are drawn to these stories where security comes from a firm gaze and a presence that doesn't back down, even when the whole world is against you, subscribe to Heart of Protection Stories to continue following each step of this bond that is only beginning to form under pressure. When Silas finally opened the car door and stepped onto the gravel, the sound was like a verdict. He walked to the porch, his steps heavy and rhythmic, and stopped a few inches from Alina. He was much taller than she remembered. A wall of flesh, bone, and leather that seemed to block the cold wind blowing from the square. He didn't look at the red mark on the door first. He looked into her eyes, searching for the tremor she was trying to hide. Silas reached out, and for a second, Alina thought he would touch her, but he only took the incident report he carried on his belt. "You shouldn't have done that, Alina," he said. His voice a restrained thunderclap, harsh and laden with something she couldn't identify. Was it anger, or was it fear for her? Those people you tried to save, they don't know what gratitude is. They only know what survival is. And now, they've decided that their survival depends on your end. The way he uttered those words made her blood run cold, but at the same time, there was a detail that didn't go unnoticed. He said they, not we. Silas was positioning himself outside the city circle. He was drawing a line on the ground, and Alina was beside him. The tension between them was almost palpable. A mixture of imminent danger and an attraction that blossomed in the most unlikely way possible, through their mutual need for justice. Silas took a step forward, closing the distance even further, and she could smell the coffee and the threatening rain. He lowered his voice, making it almost a whisper only she could hear, while his eyes scanned the neighboring houses, defying anyone watching. They think I'm going to follow the mayor's orders and take you in for questioning. They think I'm part of the plan." He paused, and a dangerous glint appeared in his eyes. "But they've forgotten that I don't serve this city. I serve the truth. And, from now on, my only priority is to ensure that no one touches you." Alina felt a shiver that had nothing to do with fear. It was the first time someone had stood between her and the rest of the world. But what Silas hadn't yet told her was the price he would have to pay for breaking this silence. He knew that by protecting her, he was signing his own death warrant in that community. And as the sky darkened and the first drop of rain hit the balcony, Alina realized that the sheriff wasn't just breaking the silence to defend her. He was declaring a war that neither of them knew if they could win. The town was watching, waiting for the first mistake. The first moment of weakness in that barrier Silas had built around her. And what would happen when the law itself was used as a weapon against the man who swore to protect her? The rain began timidly, just a whisper against the dry leaves that the wind had gathered on the porch. But within minutes, the sky collapsed in a curtain of cold, relentless water, as if nature itself wanted to wash away the secrets Alina had tried to burn. Silas remained there, standing, a physical barrier between her and the darkness of the street. While the smoke from his cigarette was carried by the damp wind, Alina looked at her own hands, still stained with an almost invisible gray dust, the only remnant of the evidence she had destroyed. At that moment, the weight of what she had done began to crush her chest, not from fear of the crime, but from the bitter realization that her empathy had, in fact, been her greatest trap. She hadn't burned that paper for money or influence. She had done it out of a desperate need to belong, a hunger for acceptance that had accompanied her since she was just a child, watching her parents, tireless outsiders, unsuccessfully try to be invited to the Sunday dinners of the traditional families of that city. Alina had always been the daughter of strangers, the girl who tended the library books with almost religious zeal, hoping that one day someone would notice she was more than just a service provider. She firmly believed that by preserving the prestige of the founding families, she would finally be buying her place at the table. She imagined that, seeing that she knew of their mistake and had chosen protective silence instead of denunciation, they would look at her with the warmth they reserved for their own. But now, under Silas's stern and protective gaze, she realized that this journey in search of affection had been built on false ground. The impact of this discovery was like a physical blow. She wasn't seeking profit, she was seeking humanity. But what she found behind the scenes of that city was a far more sinister hidden truth. They didn't want to be forgiven by her. They wanted her to have never had the power to forgive them. Silas stepped aside, letting the dim light from the balcony illuminate his face, marked by weariness and years of silent battles against corruption he couldn't prove. He saw the tremor in Alina's shoulders, and for a brief second, his armor of authority seemed to crack. He knew what it was like to be an outsider. He himself, with his badge and gun, was seen only as a necessary evil by the local elite. "You thought they'd be grateful, didn't you?" he asked, his voice lacking the judgmental tone she expected, but a kind of rough compassion, like someone who had seen this same movie end in tragedy many times. Alina nodded, tears finally breaking through the barrier of her eyelashes. She felt small, exposed, a vulnerability that seemed to attract danger like blood attracts predators. What seemed simple began to reveal unexpected layers, for Alina's decisions were not merely administrative errors, but invitations to her own destruction in the name of a dream of belonging that would never exist. She explained to Silas, her voice choked with rain and tears, how she had spent years seeing the mayor and council members as father figures in the community, people she wanted to be proud of her. She recounted how ethical solitude had led her to believe that a bureaucratic error shouldn't ruin such important names. Silas listened in silence, his jaw clenched as he processed the dangerous naivete of the woman now under his protection. He knew the city had already turned against her. Those people didn't see a kind soul. They saw a loose end that needed to be tied up or cut. the tension between them had shifted in nature. It was no longer just external danger that bound them, but a connection born from the shared pain of not being understood. Silas moved closer, and this time he didn't back down. He placed his heavy, warm hand on her shoulder, a gesture of masculine protection that was, at the same time, a silent oath. The warmth of his palm pierced the thin fabric of Elena's coat, anchoring her in the present, preventing her from drowning in her own guilt. He was the only barrier between her and the invisible militia that now patrolled the city's thoughts. Silas knew that the revelations to come would be even more brutal, and that he would have to dig deep into the rot of the founders to find a way out. But, as he looked at Elena's pale face, he realized he wasn't doing this just for the badge. There was something about her, a purity that the city had been trying to corrupt for decades, that he was willing to defend with his life. The rain continued to lash the house, and across the street, Elena saw the glint of a headlight that went out as soon as she looked in that direction. They were there, watching, waiting for Silas to leave so they could finish what they started with the stones and the red paint. She felt a chill run down her spine, a real sense that time was running out. Silas also saw the car. He didn't move abruptly, but Elena felt the tension in his muscles, the readiness of a wolf protecting its mate. He pulled her closer, away from the edge of the porch, into the shelter of the shadows of the house itself. In that moment, the world outside, with its social rules and its desire for acceptance, ceased to matter. The only reality that existed was the sound of his breath near her ear, and the implicit promise that, whatever the cost, he wouldn't let her fall. The city she had loved was now a thousand-eyed monster, all focused on the small piece of land she occupied. Elena's journey, which had begun with an act of mercy, had now become a desperate struggle for emotional and physical survival. She realized that true protection didn't come from being accepted by the crowd, but from being defended by a single man who saw her essence beyond her mistakes. Silas was her shield, and although the danger was only beginning to show its claws, the bond growing between them under that torrential rain was the only solid thing in a crumbling world. He whispered for her to go inside and lock the door, while he remained on the porch, a sentinel no one dared challenge that night. Elena obeyed, but before closing the door, she looked back and saw his silhouette against the storm. She knew then that nothing would ever be the same again. The decisions had been made, and the impact of what was to come would change not only her life, but the very foundations of every building in that city cursed by its own greed. He comments, "This story could be real." What seemed simple began to reveal unexpected layers, and the first of these layers was silence. The morning after meeting Silas, Elena woke up to the cold winter light filtering through the cracks in the window, illuminating the dust dancing in the air as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The coffee, forgotten on the table while she tried to organize her thoughts, had gone cold before she even took the first sip. The bitterness of the iced drink seemed to match the mood that had settled in her chest. She dressed mechanically, trying to maintain a facade of normalcy, convincing herself that the red mark on the door and Silas's words were merely reflections of a stormy night. But, as she crossed the threshold of her house and walked towards the square, the journey she imagined to be one of redemption began to transform into a walk through isolation. The city seemed to have undergone a chemical transformation overnight. The air no longer carried the scent of cut grass or burning wood, but a metallic odor of fear. When Elena reached the bakery, the place that had always been the heart of her social routine, the impact of reality hit her with the force of a punch. The doorbell, which always emitted a discreet tinkle, seemed to ring louder than usual, a metallic bang that announced her entrance as if it were an invasion. Immediately, the murmur of voices ceased. The pharmacy owner, who usually asked about new books, looked away at an empty shelf. The mechanic, whose children Elena helped with their school research, buried his face in a 3D-oed newspaper. It wasn't just indifference. It was an active rejection, a silent expulsion from the fabric of that community. As she approached the counter, Alina realized that the subtle detail of her downfall lay in the eyes of those who saw her. She had expected gratitude. She had hoped that, in the shadows of those minds, there would be relief that she had burned the document that could destroy their reputations. But the hidden truth that now emerged was far crueler. The city was not grateful. The city was afraid. By destroying the evidence, Alina had not become a trustworthy ally, but rather the living witness, the only remaining link between the crime and its consequences. As long as she existed and breathed, their secret would be in danger. To them, Alina was not the savior of peace, but the weak point that needed to be eliminated so that their story would remain immaculate. She felt a chill run down her spine as she understood that, in the eyes of those families, the burned paper had been only the prelude. Now, they needed to burn the memory of those who saw it. The decisions she had made with a heart full of hope now weighed like lead. She ordered her loaf of bread almost inaudibly, but the baker acted as if she were a ghost. He placed the order on the marble countertop with a brusqueness that almost broke the oppressive silence. Alina left, feeling small, her skin tingling with the sensation of dozens of fixed gazes on her back through the shop windows. That's when she saw him. Silas's patrol car was parked across the street, its engine rumbling low, like an animal on the prowl. He was there, observing the scene, seeing exactly how the city was treating her. Silas didn't intervene, didn't give a sign of recognition so as not to increase the target on her back. But his presence was the only thing preventing Alina from collapsing right there in the middle of the sidewalk. The revelations of that day didn't stop there. Upon returning to the library, Alina found the door locked from the inside. A maintenance for an indefinite period notice was pasted on the glass. The impact was immediate. They were taking away from her the only place where she felt safe, the only purpose that tied her to that land. The city was closing in like an infected wound, trying to expel the foreign body she had become. Panic began to rise, a wave of heat that contrasted with the icy morning wind. She leaned against the brick wall, feeling more like an outsider than the day she had arrived there years before. She had sought acceptance and found a verdict of social death, but as despair tried to take hold, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed in the alley next door. Silas appeared, emerging from the shadows cast by the City Hall building. He said nothing at first, only stopped beside her, his shadow covering Alina's fragile silhouette. He exuded an authority that the entire city feared, but for her, that external fear translated into absolute security. Silas looked at the notice on the door and then at her, and Alina saw in his eyes a fire she hadn't seen the night before. It wasn't just duty. It was something personal. He knew that every look of contempt she received was a failure in the justice he had sworn to protect, but it was also something that stirred the man behind the badge. "They think they can erase you," Silas said, his voice low and laden with a dangerous promise. "They think that if they take away your job, your reputation, and your peace, you'll simply vanish into thin air." He stepped forward, forcing Alina to look up, meeting the deep, stormy blue of his eyes. "But they've forgotten one fundamental thing. As long as I stand, no one dictates the fate of this city but me. And I've decided you're not going anywhere." The connection between them, forged in the pressure of that isolation, surged. Alina felt the urge to hide in his chest, to let him confront the demons she herself had awakened. His protection was no longer an abstract concept. It was the only solid reality in a world of shadows. What was to come would demand a courage she didn't know she possessed. The journey to expose the hidden truth behind the scenes at City Hall would be long and fraught with risk. But with Silas by her side, fear began to transform into something akin to determination. She realized that the cold coffee and the change in her gaze at the bakery were just the beginning of a confrontation that would shake the centuries-old foundations of that city. They wanted her to be afraid, but alongside the sheriff, Alina was learning that a vulnerable woman's greatest weapon is the silence of those who protect her, ready to be broken at the right moment. From that instant on, Her every step would be watched. But every shadow that tried to reach her would have to face the contained fury of a man who had nothing left to lose except the woman he had promised to save. From that moment on, everything began to silently change. And the weight of that change rested not only on Elena's shoulders, but also on Silas's, who watched that slow motion fall from the dark interior of his patrol car. Silas was never the type of man who believed in caped heroes or happy endings written in romance novels. He was a man shaped by harsh reality, someone who knew every crack and every stain of rot in those streets that others called home. For him, the city was not a refuge, but a living organism that devoured the innocent to feed the ego of the powerful. He had spent years observing the inner workings of power, the decisions made in smoky rooms, and the handshakes that sealed dark destinies. And now, seeing Elena standing before the locked library, he felt the impact of a hidden truth he had been trying to ignore. Her kindness was the only pure thing left in that place, and that was precisely why they wanted to destroy her. In the weeks leading up to that chaos, Silas's surveillance of Elena had been almost invisible, but constant. He noticed details that no one else did. He saw when the library lights stayed on, later than usual, outlining Elena's profile against the high windows as she lost herself among files and reports. He knew she was treading on dangerous ground, even if she believed she was only doing her job diligently. From the seat of his patrol car, strategically parked in the shadows, Silas smoked silently, watching her walk home, always hurried, always oblivious to the ambush the city itself was setting around her. The silence of the streets, for him, was not peace. It was the sound of a building tension, like the heavy air before a tornado. He knew the pattern. I knew that isolation was the first phase. The dismantling of reputations was the second. And what would come next would be the direct confrontation. The moment when the mask of civility of those families would fall to reveal the monster that lived behind it. Elena felt the cold metal of the library door against her back as Silas approached. His presence was overwhelming, not only because of his physical size, but because of the aura of unwavering authority he carried. He didn't arrive with words of comfort or promises that everything would be all right. Silas wasn't a man of flowers. He was a man of action and pragmatic protection. As he walked towards her, his right hand rested naturally on the handle of his holster, a reflexive gesture of someone who knows that danger doesn't only come from the front, but can emerge from any window or dark alley. He stopped a few inches from her, the scent of leather and recent rain enveloping Elena's senses, creating a bubble of safety that seemed impenetrable. He didn't ask if she wanted help. He simply took command of a journey she could no longer undertake alone. The revelations Silas kept to himself were like embers burning his own chest. He knew that by approaching her in that way, he was drawing a definitive line. There was no turning back for him. The transformation from city sheriff to protector of a traitor would be the end of his career, and possibly his life as he knew it. But, looking at the vulnerability in Elena's eyes, Silas felt a determination he had never experienced before. The impact of seeing her so exposed awakened in him an instinct that went beyond professional duty. It was something visceral, a romance that didn't need sweet words to exist. For it manifested itself in the readiness of his muscles and the severity of his gaze. He opened the passenger door of the patrol car with a dry, firm movement. "Get in," he said, and it wasn't an invitation, it was a protective order. Elena hesitated for a second, looking at the square where people now openly stopped to watch the scene. She saw the mayor's face in the second-floor window of the administration building, a specter of silent disapproval. By accepting that ride, she was entrusting her fate to a man the city feared, but whom she barely knew. But what else could she do? The isolation was a desert, and Silas was the only oasis of strength she could see. She got into the car, feeling the cold leather seat and the smell of metal and coffee that permeated the interior. When Silas closed the door and walked around to the driver's seat, he didn't look at the onlookers. He kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, as if he were already calculating every move of a war about to erupt. From that moment on, the dynamic between the two began to undergo a profound transformation. Within the confined space of the vehicle, the external danger seemed both more distant and more imminent. Silas started the engine, and the deep sound of the diesel seemed to drown out the whispers of the city. He didn't accelerate immediately. He waited for Alina to fasten her seatbelt, his eyes meeting hers in the rearview mirror for a brief, intense second. In that look, there was an exchange of information that 1,000 words could not convey. He knew what she had done. He knew the risk she was taking, and he was there to ensure that nothing happened to her, even if it meant going against the entire world. The decisions Silas had made behind the scenes in his own mind, long before Alina burned that paper, were finally coming to light. He was tired of protecting a law that only served to oppress the voiceless. By protecting Alina, he was protecting the last part of himself that still believed in justice. As the car drove away from the library, leaving behind the maintenance notice and hateful stares, Alina felt a strange calm begin to seep into her panic. She was no longer alone. Silas's silence, which had previously intimidated her, was now her greatest strength. They were leaving the city center, heading towards the back roads where the forest began to swallow the road. And she realized that her life, as she knew it, had ended that morning. What was beginning now was a journey of survival, where the hidden truth about who really ruled those lands would be revealed layer by layer, under the constant watch of the man she had chosen to be her shield. Write this down. This really affected me. This is where the story begins, to show what's really at stake, and the impact of human wickedness proves to be far sharper than any physical blade. As Silas drove along the tree-lined road leading to Elena's small house, the silence inside the car was broken only by the rhythmic sound of the windshield wipers, trying to clear away the persistent morning mist. Alina stared out the window, watching the landscape pass by as a blur of green and gray, feeling that her life had become exactly that, something without defined contours, where friendly faces had dissolved into a mass of hostility. She was still trying to process Silas's revelations in the library. The idea that her attempt to save the reputation of those families had been interpreted not as a noble gesture, but as an opportunity to make her the perfect scapegoat, was a hidden truth difficult to digest. She had believed that the love for the city was mutual, but now she discovered that the affection of that community was conditional and, above all, dangerous. When the car finally turned the corner of the dead-end street where Alina lived, her heart leaped in her chest. The scene that awaited her was a visual representation of the brutal transformation the city had undergone. Silas braked slowly, and Alina felt a paralyzing chill run down her spine. The small garden she had tended so lovingly was trampled. More than that, the tires of her own car, parked at the entrance, had been slashed with surgical precision, leaving the vehicle tilted like a wounded animal. But what hurt most wasn't the metal or the rubber, it was the windows. 2 of the front panes had been shattered by anonymous stones, and the shards of glass glistened on the ground like crystal tears in the pale light. Social isolation, she realized at that moment, wasn't just the silence in the bakery. It was an active weapon, used to surround its prey and leave it with no way out. Silas jumped out of the car. Before Alina could even unbuckle her seatbelt, he didn't run, but his steps were quick and heavy, his hand never straying far from the gun in his belt. He scanned the perimeter with hawk-like eyes, his jaw so tense that the muscles in his face felt like stone. He wasn't just looking for intruders. He was absorbing Elena's pain as if it were his own. When he approached the passenger door and opened it, his voice was lower than usual. Laden with a fury he struggled not to unleash on the world. "They did this to show you that you have nowhere to run," he said, as he helped her out. "They slashed the tires so you couldn't drive, and broke the window so you know they can see you, even inside your own home." Elena's journey, which had begun with a simple desire to belong, was now transforming into a survival nightmare. As they entered the house, the smell of cold air emanating from the broken windows filled her lungs. bringing with it a feeling of invasion. Silas began to close the surviving curtains, moving with an efficiency that spoke of years of experience in risky situations. He knew that behind the scenes at City Hall, the narrative was already being masterfully reversed. The mayor and his allies weren't just hiding. They were spreading the rumor that Alina had stolen the documents to blackmail them, and that the fire in the library had been her attempt to erase the evidence of her own greed. The city, fueled by fear and the need for a scapegoat, had accepted the lie without question. To them, Alina was now the villain, threatening the stability of that hypocritical peace. Alina sat on the sofa, trembling, while Silas scooped up the larger shards of glass with a shovel. The emotional impact of being betrayed by everyone she had tried to protect was overwhelming. "Why are they doing this, Silas?" "I burned the paper to help them," she whispered, her voice almost fading into the emptiness of the room. Silas stopped what he was doing and knelt in front of her. He took Elena's cold hands in his, and the contrast between his rough skin and hers was a sensory shock of protection. Decisions based on kindness are rarely understood by those who only live for power. "Alina, they can't allow you to be the savior, because that would give you a power over them that they can't bear. So, they turn you into the criminal. That's how they maintain control." The bond between the two grew stronger with each passing second of tension. Silas was no longer just the sheriff fulfilling his role. He was the only shield between her and an angry mob that was only beginning to organize. He realized that her safety in that house was an illusion. If the stones came during the night, what would come when darkness fell again? He looked at Alina, noticing how small and fragile she seemed amidst the shards of her former life, and felt a wave of masculine protectiveness that made him want to carry the entire weight of that conflict alone. He knew that the next revelations would be even more difficult, as he would have to confront his own colleagues at the precinct. Men he had known for years, and who might now be receiving orders to leave him alone in that battle. "You're not staying here," Silas declared, and there was no room for argument in his voice. "They crossed a line. If they think they can treat you like a target while I'm in charge, they're sorely mistaken." Alina looked at him, and for the first time, she saw beyond the badge. She saw the man who was willing to sacrifice his position, his reputation, and his peace to keep her from falling into the abyss. The transformation of her fear into a strange form of trust was the only point of light on that gloomy morning. Silas stood up and began gathering some of her clothes, throwing them into a bag with decisive movements. He was making decisions that would change the course of their lives forever, dragging her into a journey where the only law would be loyalty to each other. The city's retaliation was only the beginning of a behind-the-scenes war where the hidden truth would be the most valuable and, at the same time, the most dangerous weapon. As Silas carried her bag toward the police car, he stopped at the door and looked out at the deserted street, feeling the invisible eyes of the neighbors watching his every move. He knew that by taking Alina with him, he was declaring open war against the power structure of that city. But he didn't care. The impact of having Alina under his protection, of feeling her trust placed entirely in him, was what he needed to face whatever was lurking in the shadows of the coming days. The journey was only beginning, and the isolation the city tried to impose on Alina would ultimately unite to destinies that should never have crossed, in a pact of blood and protection that no one would be able to break. Now I want to delve even deeper into this matter, because the silence that followed the closing of the police station door was not a peaceful silence, but the oppressive calm that precedes the collapse of a dam. Silas didn't take her to the fluorescent-lit reception area, where the other officers could register her arrival with inconvenient questions and glances laden with ulterior motives. Instead, he led her down a side corridor, a service path that smelled of cheap disinfectant, iron, and moldy files. A place where the light barely reached and footsteps echoed like the beating of a hurried heart. Upon entering his private office, a claustrophobic space immersed in a twilight that seemed to conceal the secrets of generations, Silas locked the door. The metallic sound of the key turning was the final verdict. There, in that small room, the outside world had no jurisdiction. Silas didn't turn on the main light. He switched only on a small lamp on the worn oak table, creating a circle of yellowish light that barely illuminated his face, leaving his eyes in a dense, dangerous shadow. Remained standing, her arms crossed over her chest, trying to contain the trembling that now came not from the cold, but from the realization that she was about to enter a point of no return. The impact of what was happening began to manifest physically in her. Each shadow projected on the walls seemed like a revelation ready to attack her. Silas approached a locked drawer and, with a hesitation Alina had never seen in him, retrieved a worn folder, tied with a cord that looked about to unravel. He slammed it onto the table with a dull thud that echoed in the dark office. "You thought you were saving the reputation of good neighbors, Alina," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper, laden with a bitterness that came from the deepest recesses of that town. "But what you burned in that library was just the tip of an iceberg that has been freezing the soul of this place for decades. That report of irregularities wasn't a bureaucratic error. It was proof that the mayor and the founding families turned this town into a private ATM, built on debt and silenced lives." He leaned across the table, stepping into the circle of light, and Alina saw the weariness in his features, a transformation from sheriff into a man carrying the weight of a hidden truth that was devouring him alive. Silas's journey in search of justice had been solitary until that moment. He confessed, through gritted teeth, that he had been waiting for years for a slip-up, for an opening, for anyone who had the naivete to stir up that hornet's nest. But what he never expected, and what his decisions now reflected with evident pain, was that this person would be someone as vulnerable as he was. He expected a political opponent, an outside investigator, someone prepared for the impact of what was to come. He didn't expect the librarian who read poetry to the children and who, in a misguided act of mercy, would end up lighting the fuse of a bomb that was now in his hands. Alina felt a lump in her throat. I just wanted them to have a chance to fix things," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes again. Silas walked around the table, closing the distance between them until she could feel the warmth emanating from his body. A protective presence that was also a reminder of the risk they both faced. He placed his hands on her shoulders, his large, strong fingers gently gripping the fabric of her coat. "The people we're talking about don't fix things, Alina, they bury them. And now, they've decided that you're the one who needs to be buried." The way he spoke those words made the external danger a palpable, physical reality within that room. At that moment, the tension between them shifted. It was no longer just about the documents or the corruption. It was about the bond born from their mutual need for emotional survival. Silas looked at her with an intensity that seemed to read every thought in her mind. He saw the fear, but he also saw the silent strength that had made her burn that paper, a courage that, though misapplied, was more real than anything he had ever seen in that city. The impact of his closeness made Alina's breath catch. Silas was her protector, the man who knew the rot in every corner and who, even so, had decided that she was the only thing worth fighting for. From that point on, the decisions made behind the scenes at that police station would change the course of everything. Silas revealed parts of his investigation, names she had known since childhood, crimes that seemed impossible in such a peaceful place. He showed her that the hidden truth was like a cancer, spreading through every organ of the city. Alina realized that her journey of seeking acceptance had ended the moment the paper turned to ashes. What was beginning now was a descent into the heart of darkness, guided by the only man who knew how to navigate that darkness. The romance between them didn't need words. It was in the way he held her, in the way he swore. Silence with his gaze, and in the implicit promise that, whatever the cost, he would take her to the other side of that storm. Alina's vulnerability was what haunted Silas most. He knew that by bringing her into his dark office and revealing the extent of the danger, he was marking her forever. But he also knew there was no other choice. The city had already turned against her, and his silence was the only weapon he could still use to his advantage. As he put the briefcase back in the drawer, the sound of the metal clanging seemed like a final point in Elena's chapter of innocence. Her transformation into a reluctant but necessary ally was what was truly at stake. They were alone against a centuries-old power structure, and every minute they spent in there was a minute the city used to plan its next attack. Silas looked at the locked door, and then at Elena, and she knew that the whisper in that office had only been the beginning of a scream that would soon shake the entire region. He comments, "I saw that truth too." This is where the story begins to reveal what's truly at stake. And the weight of this revelation falls on Silas's shoulders with the force of a final judgment. In the dense silence of that office, the dim light of the lamp reflected off the polished metal of the star pinned to his chest. An object that, for over a decade, had been the guiding light of his moral compass. Silas looked at the badge, and then at Elena, and the conflict that appeared on his face was brutal and devastating. He knew he was at a crossroads where neither direction led to peace. The impact of his next decisions would dictate not only the future of that investigation, but whether Elena would see the sunrise the next day. The dilemma was clear and cruel: the star or her life. If he decided to protect her through official channels, recording every threat and every stone thrown, he would be signing his own resignation letter. The city council, controlled by the same men Elena had tried to spare, wouldn't hesitate for a second to dismiss him under any administrative pretext. Without the badge, he would lose legal access to weapons, vehicles, and, most importantly, the authority that still kept the urban militia at a minimum safe distance. Silas's journey as a lawman had always been guided by a hidden truth. He served a structure that, at its core, was designed to protect property, not people. Over the years, he had learned to navigate the backstage of this corruption, doing what he could in the shadows to maintain order, but protecting Elena required something far more radical. If he lost the star, he would become just another man against an entire city armed with hatred and influence. On the other hand, if he chose to act entirely outside the law, in the shadows, he would be throwing away everything he had built, transforming himself into what the system feared most: a rogue agent acting out of passion and self-righteousness. He looked at Elena's hands, still trembling, and felt a pang of remorse, knowing that her kindness had thrown her into that abyss. She wasn't a fighter. She was the light that he, in his hardened soul, had forgotten existed. The revelations he had made about the mayor were merely fuel for the fire that now consumed his thoughts. Silas realized that the transformation of his mission was inevitable. He could no longer be just the sheriff. He needed to be the guardian of a life the system wanted to discard. The romance that blossomed between them, though unspoken and stifled by danger, was what made this dilemma even more agonizing. Every time their eyes met, he saw in her the personification of everything he had sworn to protect, but which the law, in its current form, was ready to sacrifice. The emotional impact of this realization left him breathless. Silas brought his hand close to the badge, his fingers brushing against the cold metal. He thought of all the sacrifices he had made to carry that star, of all the sleepless nights and the scars he had collected to maintain order in that city that now betrayed him. Elena, sensing his torment, stepped forward, entering the small circle of light that united them. "Silas, if you help me, and they take your job, what will be left of you?" she asked, her voice carrying the pain of someone who understands that love and protection often demand irreparable sacrifices. Silas looked at her, and the hardness in his expression softened for a brief moment, revealing the vulnerable man who lived beneath the uniform. What would be left of him without the star? Perhaps just an ordinary man, but a man who, for the first time in years, could sleep knowing he hadn't been complicit in the destruction of an innocent soul. He knew the council was already meeting behind the scenes at City Hall, preparing the papers for his suspension as soon as he took the first official step in her defense. The hidden truth was that Silas had already made his decision the moment he first saw her in that library. But admitting this to himself meant accepting that his life as he knew it was dead. He realized that the protection he offered Alina was the only thing that still gave meaning to his existence. The conflict between duty and sentiment was a battle he couldn't win without losing a part of himself. If he kept the star, he would have formal power, but his hands would be tied by the assassin's bureaucracy. If he protected her as a man, he would be free to act. But without the safety net the badge provided, it was a choice between being a powerless hero or an effective renegade. From that moment on, the tension in the office became almost physical, as if the walls were closing in on them. Silas took a deep breath, the smell of leather and gunpowder mingling with Elena's soft, lingering perfume, a contrast that perfectly defined his current world. He knew that the urban militia, incited by the mayor's whispers, was just waiting for the green light to act. The city was silent, but it was the silence of a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. Silas looked at the police station door, knowing that as soon as he stepped out with Alina by his side, the clock would start ticking. His decisions in the next few minutes would have a cascading impact that would affect every resident of that region. He finally removed his hand from the badge and placed it on Elena's shoulder, a gesture of possession and protection that sealed their fate. "They can take my star, Elena, but they can't take away the fact that I'm the only thing standing between them and you," he said, his voice an oath etched in granite. Silas's transformation was complete. He was no longer just the sheriff, subservient to a corrupt council. He was a man on a journey of redemption, willing to descend to the depths of the abyss to ensure she returned to the surface. The romance between them, forged in the fire of that injustice, was now his only law. He knew the path ahead would be marked by painful revelations and a danger that would test every fiber of his being. But feeling the weight of Elena's trust upon him, the dilemma vanished. The choice had been made, and all that remained was the fight. What seemed simple began to reveal unexpected layers, and the wet asphalt they left behind seemed to be the last frontier between hypocritical civilization and the wild refuge where they now found themselves. The cabin, an old, resilient wooden structure hidden beneath the dense embrace of the mountains, trembled slightly under the lash of the heavy rain that beat against the zinc roof. Outside, the world Alina knew had been replaced by an impenetrable curtain of water and darkness. Inside, the only point of reference was the sound of Silas's heavy breathing and the incipient crackling of a fireplace he had just lit. The impact of everything they had experienced in the last few hours still throbbed in Elena's body, but the real wound wasn't just on her skin. The stone that had cut her face was merely the physical symbol of a much deeper disillusionment that now gnawed at her soul. She sat on a rustic wooden bench, her hands resting on her knees, watching Silas move with the silent agility of a man accustomed to operating behind the scenes of survival. He carried no flowers, no empty promises, nor the easy comfort of sweet words. He carried a basin of warm water and a clean cloth, the tools of a protection that did not ask permission to exist, but imposed itself as the only solid truth amidst the chaos. The candlelight cast long, dramatic shadows on the log walls, accentuating Silas's transformation from a distant authority figure into something far more intimate, dense, and dangerous. As he approached, Alina didn't recoil. She watched as he knelt between her legs, a closeness that, in any other situation, would be an invitation to romance, but which here was a healing ritual forged in fear and absolute necessity. His touch was unexpectedly gentle, a stark contrast to the brutality of the world outside. His large, calloused fingers, which had so often gripped the cold metal of a weapon to maintain order, now slid with an almost painful delicacy across her cheek. As he wiped the dried blood from the wound, Alina felt a tremor run down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold of the night. It was the tremor of pure disillusionment. She looked at the ceiling, trying to hold back tears, as she realized that the empathy that had guided her entire life was precisely what had made her a target. The city she had tried to save had revealed its hidden truth, and the weight of that betrayal was a journey she didn't know if she had the strength to complete. Silas noticed the tremor and paused for a second, his dark blue eyes meeting hers in a silence that seemed to last an eternity, filled only by the sound of the storm. He saw in her not just a victim, but the personification of a purity he had sworn to defend, even if it cost him his own position. The connection that was born between them in that hideout didn't have the lightness of cinematic encounters. It was a bond of emotional survival, a link sealed by the realization that both were now outcasts of a rotten system. Silas set aside the cloth and, in a gesture that broke any remaining professional barrier, he held her hands in his. Elena's hands were cold and lifeless, but his were like embers, a source of vital warmth that seemed to be the only real thing in that ocean of lies and bitter revelations. He squeezed them firmly, as if trying to transfer some of his own armor to her fragile spirit, anchoring her in the present while her past crumbled in the background of memory. It was at that moment, with the sound of thunder echoing through the mountains, like a warning that danger still lurked, that Silas spoke in a voice that was a whisper of authority and an irrevocable promise. They may have the keys to the city, Elena, but I have the keys to this cell, and you are the only innocent person who has ever entered it. The phrase echoed off the wooden walls, laden with a meaning that transcended the physical. For Silas, that isolated cabin was his private cell, the place where he hid his true essence from the rest of humanity, and letting Elena in was the greatest decision he had ever made. For her, those words were the final blow she needed to understand that his protection was not a prison, but the only safe place in a world that had become a battlefield. The hidden truth that Silas had revealed before now merged with the warmth of his hands, creating an invisible barrier against the evil that roared outside. They were alone, surrounded by the forest and the fury of nature. But for the first time since the report had been burned, Elena didn't feel helpless. She looked at Silas's scarred face, at the invisible scars of a man who had spent his life protecting others while no one protected him, and understood that her transformation was complete. She was no longer the woman seeking acceptance from a cowardly community. She was the woman who had found her home in the arms of a man who had defied the very power structure for her. Their journey was only entering its most dangerous phase, where the shadows of the city would try to reach them even in that refuge. But the bond growing between them under the sound of the heavy rain was something no council or urban militia could break. As Silas continued to hold her hands, Elena closed her eyes, finally allowing herself to feel his protection like a cloak, knowing that, although tomorrow was uncertain, that night she wouldn't have to face the darkness alone. He comments, "This story could be real." From that moment on, everything began to silently change, and the truths that Silas had managed to wrest from the clutches of the city council brought not peace, but a kind of dense, electric silence, like the air that precedes a natural disaster. Silas had left Elena in momentary safety under the guard of one of the few subordinates he still trusted to confront the backroom power struggles in the town hall's main hall. There, surrounded by men whose names were tarnished by the hidden truth that Elena had tried to burn, he played his last card. With a cold voice and his gaze fixed on the mayor, Silas demanded a 24-hour deadline to organize the evidence and formalize the custody. He used the very bureaucracy they so loved to tie the executioner's hands for a single day. It was a desperate move, one of the riskiest decisions of his journey, but the impact was immediate. The council backed down, not out of ethics, but out of fear that a public execution at that moment would attract the unwanted attention of the capital. When Silas returned to the police station, the sun was already beginning to set, tinging the clouds with a sickly purple that seemed to reflect the state of mind of that community. He found Elena standing by the second-floor window, observing the street with an expression that mixed terror and profound resignation. The danger hadn't disappeared. It had only become better organized. On the other side of the square, In the bar that used to be the meeting point for laughter and hunting stories, the men of the town were beginning to gather. They weren't there to drink, but to keep watch. Alina saw, through the fogged glass, the faces of people she considered friends: the mechanic, the grocery store owner, the postman, all now reduced to a silent militia, waiting only for the end of those 24 hours to finish what they started. The transformation of those neighbors into predators was the most painful revelation of this entire journey, a blow that struck her soul with more force than any stone. Silas walked toward her, his heavy footsteps echoing on the wooden floor of the empty police station. He didn't need to say that time was running out. The ticking of the wall clock seemed to have become the loudest sound in the world. He stopped beside her, keeping a respectful distance, but his presence was like an invisible shield enveloping her. He also glanced at the bar, identifying each of the men now conspiring behind the scenes of that macabre vigil. He knew the mayor wouldn't accept the postponement passively. Those 24 hours would be used to arm the city, to spread more lies, and to ensure that, when the deadline arrived, no one would be on the sheriff's side. The weight of these decisions rested on him, but looking at Elena's profile, illuminated by the twilight, Silas felt that any sacrifice would be small compared to the need to keep her alive. The bond between them, forged in the fire of that injustice, was undergoing its own transformation. It was no longer just about a sheriff protecting a citizen. It was about two castaways clinging to the same piece of wood in a stormy sea. Silas placed his hand on the windowsill, near hers but without touching it, a gesture of silent solidarity. Alina felt the warmth emanating from him, a raw, contained strength that seemed to be the only solid thing in a world dissolving into betrayal. She realized that Silas's journey was now intrinsically linked to hers. He had crossed the Rubicon for her, and there was no turning back for either of them. The revelations that would come in the next few hours would be the ultimate test of their courage, and the impact of each choice made in that dark room would determine whether they would have a future or be just another story of tragedy forgotten by the history of that city. The calm was illusory. Inside the police station, the silence was filled with the sounds of Silas's preparations, the metallic click of ammunition being checked, the radio crackling with increasingly hostile communications, and the persistent smell of stale coffee. Silas was preparing for a war he hoped to avoid, but knew was inevitable. He looked at Alina and saw that she was changing too. Her initial fragility was being replaced by a grim determination, the strength of someone who had already lost everything except their own dignity. They were now the guardians of a hidden truth that the city was willing to burn along with them, and the 24-hour truce was merely the stage for the final confrontation being orchestrated behind the scenes of those deserted streets. As night fell and the lights of the bar across the street shone with a menacing intensity, Silas approached Alina and whispered, in a voice that was a mixture of command and promise, "Rest now, Alina. They think they've bought time, but we have to. And tomorrow, when this sun rises, they'll discover that the law I follow isn't the one they bought, but the one I carry within me." The touch of his gaze was the last comfort before the political and physical storm that was about to break over them. The city was waiting, the council was plotting, and the clock continued its merciless countdown. But amidst the fear and destruction, there was now a space filled by the unwavering presence of the man who had chosen to be her only barrier against the abyss. What seemed simple began to reveal unexpected layers, and that night, which should have been a restful interlude, became the stage for Silas's definitive transformation and the conclusion of a journey of accumulated silences. As the minutes dragged on like heavy raindrops on glass, Alina watched Silas prepare for the inevitable. There was no more room for diplomatic decisions or behind-the-scenes maneuvers. The impact of what they had discovered together was an open wound that no longer accepted makeshift bandages. Silas approached the police station door, adjusting the leather belt where the badge he had so honored rested, but his eyes, meeting hers through the dim light, revealed a hidden truth that transcended any regulation. He was no longer fighting for the law of that city, he was fighting for her. The air between them vibrated with an electric tension, a romance born in the epicenter of a storm, where the only permitted touch was the silent promise that no one would be left behind. Alina felt her heart pound against her ribs, like a caged bird. She watched as Silas opened the double doors and stepped out onto the covered balcony, braving the cold wind that carried the scent of damp earth and imminent betrayal. Outside, the men who had gathered at the bar crossed the street, forming a line of shadows under the pale light of the lampposts. They were faces she knew, voices that had once wished her sweet dreams, now distorted by a greed she never imagined existed. Silas stopped at the edge of the balcony, his imposing silhouette blocking the entrance to the police station, becoming the only physical and moral barrier between Elena's vulnerability and the organized fury of that community. The impact of his presence was like a thunderclap that silenced the murmurs of the crowd. He didn't need to draw his weapon for everyone to understand that the rules had changed. The revelations Silas had kept hidden for years, in the depths of his conscience, had finally come to light. He looked at the mayor, who remained at the rear of the group, protected by his henchmen, and a bitter smile crossed his lips. Silas knew that each of those people had a price, and that Alina was the only one to offer something that could not be bought: mercy. Silas's dilemma: to star, or his life had been resolved, not with words, but with the posture of a man who had discovered that true justice sometimes requires breaking the law of men to honor the law of the heart. He took a deep breath, the icy air filling his lungs, and his voice, when it finally broke the silence, was not that of an officer fulfilling a duty, but that of a man protecting his world. Alina, observing everything from behind the door, felt a mixture of dread and a profound admiration that blossomed like a rose on the asphalt. She realized that Silas' journey had been as lonely as hers, and that this encounter, amidst danger and injustice, was fate collecting a debt of protection that the city owed them both. Silas took a step forward, the streetlights reflecting off the metal of his badge for a final second before he plunged back into the shadows. He spoke to the square, to the bar, to the closed windows, and to every cowardly soul hiding behind stones and lies. In a city where silence is bought with blood, the sheriff finally spoke. But what he said wasn't a warning to them. It was a promise that, to reach her, they would have to get past the only man who still knew where the bodies were buried. The silence that followed Silas's promise was not the end, but the birth of something that no human law or city decree could explain. Sometimes, life puts us in dead ends, only so that we can discover who would truly be willing to hold our hand before the abyss, transforming danger into an altar of loyalty. This channel exists to tell stories that stay with you, that resonate in your soul long after the video ends. If you want to continue feeling this connection and exploring the strength of those who choose to protect at all costs, subscribe to Heart of Protection Stories. It is the way for us to continue walking together along these paths of courage. If any part of Silas' sacrifice or Elena's resilience touched you, your like is a simple and silent way to show me that this story found a place in your heart, and so that I know we share this same emotional frequency. Write in the comments, "This story spoke to me." Our journey through these layers of feeling, risk, and hidden truth doesn't end here. The next video is already waiting for you right next to this one, so we can continue in exactly the same atmosphere. Click and follow me there.